you very much, Chris and Amanda and everyone at the conference. It looks like you're going to have a great few days, and I'm very glad that I could spend a little bit of time with you. Of course, I'd love to give you an actual tour of the St. Louis Sound exhibit in person, but that wasn't able today. And I'm not just saying that because of the Zoom problems. I would really like to see people in person. But what I've done is I've asked one of our videographers to basically do a video of the exhibit that I will speak over, making the usual stops that I make in an in-person tour. And so we'll start that in just a minute. I'm hoping that we accomplish three things today. I'm hoping to share with you a little bit of St. Louis music history. I'm certainly hoping to give you a glimpse inside the exhibit. And then at various stops, I hope to talk about some of the behind the scenes stories about our approach to this exhibit and to exhibits in general. So we will see if I can get this to work. So, Chris, maybe you can tell me, are you seeing the full screen?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So, very good. Welcome to St. Louis Sound. The main goal of this exhibit was to prove that St. Louis is one of the great American musical cities. So we think of Chicago and Memphis and Nashville and New Orleans and Austin, but St. Louis should really be included in that list. It's one of the greatest American music cities, has a fascinating and rich history, and I hope that I will prove that to you today. So we oftentimes talk about that this exhibit goes from the dawn of recorded sound all the way up to today. And we really talk about the dawn of recorded sound at the very beginning. What you're seeing here is the oldest piece of recorded music that we can still hear today. The St. Louis Tinfoil was recorded in June 22nd, 1878 at the Steinberg Hat Shop on 4th Street. This little piece of fragile tinfoil has 78 seconds of a person, we think Thomas Mann, who was a St. Louis writer at the time that we know bought one of the first 10 phonographs ever produced. Just 6 months after Edison invented the phonograph, he recorded on this St. Louis tinfoil. It has a cornet solo, a few nursery rhymes, some small bits of music. Like I said, it's only 78 seconds long, but it's one of the most important pieces of recorded history that we have in the United States. In fact, the Library of Congress just listed this as part of their National Historic Registry, which are the pieces of recorded sound that they think should be preserved for all time. It lives at the Museum of Science and Innovation in Schenectady, New York, but they allowed us to borrow it for this particular show. A few years ago at the Missouri History Museum, we showcase the Louisiana Purchase, the first time that Thomas Jefferson signed his name to the land deal that would reshape the United States and make St. Louis an American city. It only comes out from the archives once every 10 or 12 years. It was one of those things that you could say, I got to see the Louisiana Purchase document. I feel like this St. Louis tinfoil, the oldest piece of recorded sound that we can still hear today, is one of those great museum moments where you get to say, I saw that. I saw the oldest piece of recorded music that we can still hear today. A pretty special moment in the exhibit, and what allows us to say that we truly start at the dawn of recorded sound and go all the way up to today. The next thing you'll see to the left is sort of a wall that we created about how people listen to music and how that changed over time. So it starts with some early phonographs, goes through the 8-track cassette tapes, of course, comes all the way to today, but what young people are listening to, including my two daughters is back to vinyl. So they're listening to vinyl recordings. I had expected a lot of discussions about the 8-track tapes. Oh, I remember listening to those. But actually, because we work in a history museum, I've had several of my staff members come up and say, oh yeah, I still have a couple of those old phonographs in my house. That Blue Moon radio that you saw, I oftentimes tell visitors is the one thing that if I could steal something from this exhibit, and I would never do it, that's what I would steal. The next section is about ragtime in St. Louis and really goes through, this is a history of popular music in St. Louis history. And, you know, at the turn of the century, pop music was ragtime, and St. Louis was a real ragtime capital. So in that map, you learn about Tom Turpin, who was the first African-American to ever publish a rag. You learn about Louis Chauvin, who was a real contemporary of Scott Joplin's, played piano with him, was really St. Louis's preeminent ragtime piano player. You also learn about some of the women in rag, including people like Irene Giblin, who was able to publish some of her rags, but mostly was relegated to being a ragtime demonstrator at department stores. So to play piano at department stores and show off the ragtime sheet music that the store owners were hoping people would buy. Of course, the king of pop during that time period was Scott Joplin. Scott Joplin was born in Texarkana, Arkansas, moved to Sedalia, and eventually moved to St. Louis. He lived in St. Louis from 1901 to 1907. It is where he published the Maple Leaf Rag and the Entertainer. Maple Leaf Rag was probably more popular at the time. The Entertainer, of course, gains a lot of popularity in the 1970s when Robert Redford and Paul Newman feature it prominently in a movie called The Sting. By the way, I've been asking a lot of visitors, assuming that they would know that movie, and fewer and fewer know it. But what you're seeing here is actually what Scott Joplin wished that he would be remembered for. These are costumes from Scott Joplin's ragtime opera called Treemonisha. He creates it in 1910, and he really felt like it was his life's work and his biggest achievement. It follows a girl named Monisha in rural Arkansas. She's visited by these sort of voodoo conjurers and who try to trap her. She has to use her smarts to escape. It really was an opera about African-American uplift and people using education to overcome challenging circumstances. But it was odd. As you can see from, this is a bear suit from one scene that was called The Frolic of the Bears, where I think 8 different bears come out and dance around. Joplin tried to get this published during his lifetime, but never could. He self-published it, but he could never get it performed. He dies in 1917, never seeing it performed. It would not be performed until 1972 when East St. Louis dancer Katherine Dunham puts on a production for Morehouse College. It does eventually go to Broadway and is performed there, but mostly forgotten. I think the St. Louis Opera performed it in 2000, but rarely gets produced and certainly didn't get produced in his lifetime. Sort of a behind the scenes museum moment. You know, we talk a lot about what should drive an exhibit. Should it be stories? Should it be what we have in our collections? And certainly most exhibits like this one are both. You know, we've had exhibits like #1 in Civil Rights where we just didn't have much in our collection, but we knew it was such an important story that we wanted to tell it. We've had other exhibits like Little Black Dress from Morning to Night that we knew we wanted to highlight our fascinating and rich and one of the biggest textile collections in the United States. And then we drove the story from the collection. St. Louis Sound is a little bit of both, but this is one of those great moments where the collection really drives the story. We had this bear suit in our collection. I'm not sure we would have focused on Treemonisha as much as we did if we didn't let the collection drive. But by doing that, I'm able to tell visitors that throughout this exhibit, they'll hear from some people who they absolutely know. They know the name Scott Joplin, they know the song, The Entertainer, but they haven't heard this story. And so the object really allows us to tell that story. There's a photo, it's a little hard to see with the glare from the case, of that Katherine Dunham performance and one of the dancers wearing the bear suit in the background there. So a fascinating story about Scott Joplin. We have here a radio timeline. This looks at early radio in St. Louis. It introduces you to people like Wiley Price, who was the first African-American radio announcer. Really like there in the middle, it talks about the hillbilly shows that were a big feature of KMOX. It does mention this woman who was the very first radio host in St. Louis, Virginia Jones, went on the air for KSD, which was the actual radio station for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch newspaper. That radio station, by the way, was one of only 6 radio stations in the country that played Calvin Coolidge's speech on December 6, 1923, which was the first time that a president had given a presidential address over the radio airwaves. As you saw, like a very small piece, but you learn about Virginia Jones, you learn about the first presidential address ever done on radio and the fact that St. Louis was one of 6 cities that broadcast that. This section is about those hillbilly shows that I mentioned that were a big part of KMOX. You learn about Les Paul, who probably many of you know as a jazz guitarist, but he started on the hillbilly shows as Rhubarb Red. And St. Louis really was a hub of that. You also, by the way, on that radio wall, see one of the very first radios, which was basically a radio kit that you had to put together yourself and hook up to basically like a acid car battery to get to work. Fascinating. This goes into the jazz era, and if there's anyone who epitomizes the jazz era, it was Josephine Baker. Josephine Baker was born in St. Louis in 1906. She had a difficult childhood, born into poverty, lots of family issues. She would go on the streets of St. Louis and dance and sing and do routines to earn money, hat in hand. It was there where the manager of the Booker T. Washington Theater in St. Louis saw her and thought she was the funniest thing he had ever seen, and so brought her on stage. She goes on stage and is soon recognized by people on the vaudeville circuit, makes it to New York, and of course famously moves to France to get away from American racism. What you see there, sorry I didn't stop it early enough, is a poster from the Folies Bergère. It is where she premiered the banana skirt dance, which she is probably most famous for, and you saw the illustration to the left. But you can see what happens throughout her career and sort of how much she is respected toward the end of that career. Of course, a lot of that comes from being a French war hero. She famously was part of intelligence efforts for the French. This is one of her last performances at the Folies Bergère. She had 30 different costume changes. She performed pieces about famous women in history. She sang difficult songs like Ave Maria. It shows you the trajectory of her career from a little bit of something to be gawked at and laughed at to this well-respected both military person and artist. You may have heard that on November 30th, the French government is going to honor Josephine Baker by interring her ashes at the Pantheon. a very rare honor for women. She is a very rare honor for people who weren't born in France, and she will be the first Black woman interned there. So alongside of Voltaire and Victor Hugo and Marie Curie will be Josephine Baker, born right here in St. Louis. And we will be having a ceremony that evening as well. Just wanted to show you that one thing that we allow visitors to do is dig deeper. This is a blues and jazz interactive. We knew that the hardest thing about a St. Louis Sound exhibit is trying to include everything you want. And so this was one way we did that. Lots of names, lots of stories. And what I also love is that whenever you hit on someone like Barrel House, Buck McFarland, and because it's me, you have to click on it 3 times. You can also not only learn their story, but you can hear sound from them. You can hear music from them. And so one thing we can talk about a little bit later, or maybe at the end in the Q&A, is how we dealt with how much sound we wanted just living in the gallery. I mean, this is an exhibit about music history. The biggest and best artifact in many ways is the music itself. But we didn't want to pour all of it into the gallery. Actually, while I'm mentioning that, let me mention something on this. If you notice underneath those big records, you see a small circle on each of those songs. That is a playlist that we created. So throughout the exhibit, on every person that's mentioned, you'll see a little record. You can download an app. And then when you go through, you can click on that. And so if you wanted to hear Duncan and Brady and you clicked on, we can't see what number that is, whatever number that is, it'll pull it up on your phone and you can listen to it. We encourage visitors to listen on their headphones so that they're not pouring music throughout the gallery. I think it includes 101 songs on the playlist. So it's a great way to experience the exhibit through audio as well as through what you're reading. So St. Louis is famous for 3 different murder ballads that get started based on cases in St. Louis: Duncan and Brady, Stagger Lee, and Frankie and Johnny. We'll talk about Frankie and Johnny. In 1899, Frankie Baker shot and killed her boyfriend, Alan Britt. Stories differ on what happened. Some people, and I think the label says that she found him in bed with another woman. There's another story that she saw him slow dancing with another woman the night before. Either way, we know that argument ensued. Frankie Baker ends up shooting and killing Alan Britt. She says it's because that he came at her with a knife. A jury, by the way, later agrees and finds her not guilty of the murder. But while she escaped that verdict, she was not able to escape the notoriety that this case would have. Just weeks later, songs were recorded about Frankie and Alan. Later changed to Frankie and Albert, and then later changed to Frankie and Johnny. We don't know exactly why. We think that songwriters just liked the sound of Frankie and Johnny better. Although we do know that Alan Britt's family was very unhappy that he was getting so much attention and that their name was being used. Frankie Baker was also unhappy. The notoriety from the songs and plays and even ballets that were made about Frankie and Johnny really haunted her. People would come up to her, some people asking for autographs, but some people yelling at her for killing Alan Britt. She eventually moves to Omaha to try to get away from the notoriety, and it still follows her as more films are made about this one case. She eventually moves to Portland, Oregon, where she ends up dying in a mental institution. So, we think about sort of fandom today and how people go too far and people stalk people. It was happening in the late 1890s and 1900s as well. Next, we have Henry Mule Townsend, a blues artist who recorded albums in 9 consecutive decades, making him one of the most prolific musicians ever. Well known in blues circles, but one of those great examples of people who were well known at their time, but largely forgotten today. One thing I wanted to mention was that piano. I don't think we got an angle of it, but when you come to the gallery, you'll see that the notes for every key is handwritten on the piano keys, and that's because Henry Townsend also used this piano to teach his son, Alonzo Townsend, and others to play. Alonzo Townsend gave us this piano, or donated it to our collection several years ago before we were ever planning a music exhibit, because he just wanted the legacy of his father preserved. When we did announce that we were going to do an exhibit, we of course knew that we were going to feature Henry Townsend. And his son actually helped us create a benefit concert. Another interesting sort of behind the scenes story about this exhibit. We did a benefit concert at the old Rock House to help us with conservation efforts. So people knew that by attending this concert, which had, I think, 8 or 10 different acts, that they would basically be helping conserve this piano so it could be put on display. Henry Townsend, by the way, the first Missourian to be named a National Heritage Fellow from NEA. I guess maybe the song most associated with St. Louis is the St. Louis Blues, but written by a guy who was mostly known for living in Memphis. So W.C. Handy only spent about 6 months in St. Louis in 1882. It did not go particularly well for him. He found himself sort of penniless and shirtless and living on the river. Underneath the Eads Bridge. It was there where he heard what he called the weirdest music he had ever heard. It's something that we would probably call the blues. It was 2 decades later when he was back in Memphis when he published the St. Louis Blues. In the early 20th century, it was the most recorded song after Silent Night. We know that at least 1,800 different versions of the St. Louis Blues have been published. I did, in sort of museum world, wanted to point out that little monitor beside it. Oftentimes, especially at the Missouri History Museum, we will do films that are very large. You'll see some of those throughout. But sometimes these small monitors can carry a lot of weight too. We just wanted to let people hear the St. Louis Blues. This was a version done by the Mound City Blue Blowers in 1927. Next, you'll see interactive called Would You Have Liked Jazz? We basically take visitors through 5 or 6 different prompts that ask them questions. Like, I think the first one you're gonna see is, do you like alcohol? Do you drink alcohol? I fessed up and said, yes, I do. And so it says that because of that, I would probably have liked jazz. But it also asks, do you like vocal music or instrumental? Do you want music played exactly the same way every time? Or do you like variations of that music? That was an idea, by the way, that we pretty much stole. I think I'm supposed to say we're inspired by an exhibit from the National Constitution Center about Prohibition. They had a monitor that said, would you have been for Prohibition or against it? It asked you a series of questions and then gave you an answer at the end. We thought that something fun would be to do a similar approach for jazz. It's just another example, and I talk to staff members all the time about keeping your eye out and looking at other exhibits and how approaches can be modified for our purposes. This is a map of St. Louis where you can hit on different places and learn the history of what happened in that place in St. Louis. So I think this one's going to be about an early radio station. One important feature for us for this was that this was a way to include a lot more stories that maybe we didn't have artifacts for, maybe we couldn't include stories for, or maybe a person only had a small relation to St. Louis. So Donny Hathaway, probably more associated with Chicago, but did grow up here and did go to high school at Vashon in St. Louis. It was a way for us to get those stories in. I told our guest services staff that the number one thing you're going to hear, and I think this is proven true, is people coming out of the exhibit saying, I can't believe you didn't include this person. I can't believe you didn't include this person. This is my favorite singer ever, and she wasn't in there. These types of features where we have these dig deeper sections are because we want to up the visitor experience, but also because it allows us to pack a lot more in. This is one of the biggest cases and features in the exhibit. It features a wide variety of artists on two sides. So I think you'll see the other side in just a moment. All the male members of the Fifth Dimension were from St. Louis. I oftentimes like to point out Oliver Sane. He was known as the man with the golden horn. He was equally important as radio song producer. He helped Fontella Bass get her start. He wrote Don't Mess Up a Good Thing. He also started Archway Studios, which was the first Black-owned and operated studio in St. Louis and maybe in the United States. What you're seeing there, what you just saw, was a dress that Tina Turner wore in the 1982 New Year's Eve edition of The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. That was loaned to us from her childhood home museum. The dress represents the later part of her career, but we also, of course, wanted to feature where she got her start, which was right here in St. Louis and East St. Louis. It was at an Ike Turner show in East St. Louis that a young Anna Bullock jumps on stage during intermission, grabs the microphone of the drummer, and starts wailing. Ike Turner immediately fell in love and wanted her to be part of the stage show. He did make her part of a stage show, but she wasn't the lead singer. That wouldn't happen until they went to record A Fool in Love. Ike Turner had actually written it for someone else. That person did not show up. Tina Turner was there to sing, not then Tina Turner, then Anna Bullock, was there to sing backup vocals. But Ike Turner said, well, you know all the words, so why don't you go ahead and sing it? She recorded a demo of it. Ike Turner had not planned on using that version. He actually planned on recording over it with the person who was supposed to show up. But he was playing it at this club, the Club Imperial in St. Louis, and a local disc jockey heard it and said, are you crazy? Do you know what you've got? You've got to release this. They release it as A Fool in Love, and it skyrockets up the charts. Ike Turner changes Anna Bullock's name to Tina Turner. One reason he did that was because he wanted to copyright the name. And in case she ever left, he thought he could just replace her with another Tina Turner, which seems impossible to believe. Tina Turner, by the way, one of the few people in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame who is listed both for her duo career, but also as an individual artist. If we had stopped at the Club Imperial, you would notice that we had the marquee letters. We also had the old Sputnik lights that were in the lounge. We had the door to Ike Turner's office and a piece of the dance floor. There are only 5 trumpeters who have been given Lifetime Achievement Awards for the Grammys, and 2 of them came from St. Louis, Miles Davis and Clark Terry. Miles Davis is certainly the better known. You'll see 2 of their trumpets here, and that's a jacket from one of Miles Davis's last shows. Clark Terry also deserves to be known. Clark Terry was the first Black member of the Tonight Show band. You see the other side of that big case that I was telling you about. Albert King was known as the Velvet Bulldozer, played that flying V guitar, which we got from Stax Museum. Known for playing the guitar upside down because he was left-handed, and when he was a kid couldn't afford a left-handed guitar, so he played a right-handed guitar and just played it upside down. You also saw Fontella Bass's gold record for Rescue Me. It's a good reminder of how many people we relied on in the community for this exhibit. That came from Fontella Bass's daughter, but like so much of this history, she said, yeah, I think I still have the gold record. It's in the closet somewhere. I'll have to go look for it. And then she said, oh yeah, and I'm gonna have to glue the label back on because that fell off. This is about Chuck Berry and Johnny Johnson. That's Chuck Berry's guitar and Johnny Johnson's piano. Chuck Berry probably needs no introduction. John Lennon said if you wanted to give rock and roll another name, you could just call it Chuck Berry because he's the definition of rock and roll. In the 70s, when NASA wanted to send a gold record up to space with all sorts of recorded sounds, symphonies and speeches, they included only one rock and roll song, and that was Johnny Be Good by Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry, of course, continued to play late into his life at the Blueberry Hill Duck Room in town. Johnny Johnson might be less well known. Johnson was a piano player with Chuck Berry and really was the star at the beginning before Chuck eclipsed him. Johnny Johnson doesn't get much credit until much later in his career when people like Keith Richards and Bo Diddley support a lawsuit that he files against Chuck Berry, saying that he co-wrote many of those songs and deserved credit. It gets thrown out of the courts, but mostly on a, because it timed out because of statute of limitations. By the way, we can talk about this in a minute during the Q&A section, but I had many meetings the first 3 weeks of the run of this show with the Chuck Berry family and his estate, who were not happy that we talked about either this Johnny Johnson part or some of the personal issues that Chuck Berry faced. So we can talk more about that in a minute. I did quickly want to show you this case where we feature the Welders. I think that's going to come up next. The Welders was a punk rock band in the 70s. They were incredibly well known here, but had never released an album. But whenever the person who created this exhibit, public historian Andrew Wonko, went out, everyone said, oh, you've got to talk about the Welders. You've got to talk about the Welders. He interviewed them. They still had the costumes from their shows. They did release one record in the 2000s, actually, because someone found an old tape that they had recorded. One thing I love about that story, though, is, you know, you just saw Chuck Berry and Albert King and Miles Davis. Imagine what it feels like to be a part of a punk rock group that you didn't know was still remembered and to find yourself featured alongside of those great artists. The Welders came to opening night. They're thinking of releasing another album now that they've gotten some attention again. Actually, one of the people from the Welders plays a flying V guitar, and she was going to loan us that guitar for the exhibit. And Andrew, our public historian, was very excited. He said, oh, that's great. He said, we also have a flying V guitar from Albert King. And she said, oh, no, then we can't show my flying V guitar up against Albert King. This section is called Flyover Country and talks about some of those areas of St. Louis music history that people don't normally associate with St. Louis. So we know that ragtime and the blues are popular, but you know, we also had an incredible influence on alt country, for example. A couple of guys were singers for Uncle Tupelo, Jeff Tweedy and Jay Farrar. They both deserved credit and both wanted attention, and that doesn't always work when you're a band. So Uncle Tupelo breaks up and Jeff Tweedy goes on to form Wilco, and Jay Farrar goes on to form Sunvolt. One way that I tell visitors about how important St. Louis's contribution is to alt country, when Pitchfork, a music magazine, listed the top 10 alt country albums of all time, 3 came from these people. Number 1 was from Uncle Tupelo, number 4 was from Sunvolt, and number 5 was from Wilco. By the way, when Wilco management first gave us a guitar, loaned us a guitar for this exhibit, they accidentally loaned us one that Jeff Tweedy still uses on tour and had to call us back a week before the exhibit opened and said, oh yeah, we need that guitar back. We can switch one out for you. One of the most fascinating moments in St. Louis music history happened on July 2nd, 1991, and that was at the Riverport Amphitheater, which you'll see in just a minute. This hooligan's name was Axl Rose. He led Guns N' Roses. They were playing at the Riverport Amphitheater on July 2nd, 1991. A person in the crowd was taking pictures. Axl Rose told him to stop. He did not stop. So Axl Rose jumped into the audience and started a melee that would result in 60 injuries and more than $200,000 in damage. Fans later made shirts that said, I survived the jungle, based on the Welcome to the Jungle Guns N' Roses song. Axl Rose, for the rest of his tour, wore a St. Louis Sucks shirt and said he would never play in St. Louis again. He did, in fact, play in St. Louis again. One of my favorite artifacts, and sorry it wasn't on screen, was the back of one of those seats that was being thrown around during the riot. And what I love about it is throughout this exhibit, you see lots of guitars and saxophones and all kinds of things. You don't expect to see the back of an amphitheater seat, and it sort of stops you in your tracks. Okay, I know we need to go a little bit fast toward the end. Nelly is the preeminent rap artist from St. Louis and one of the most heralded rap artists of all times. He's the 4th most selling rap artist in music history. Country Grammar goes diamond, which has only happened to 9 rap albums. You see that one of those big examples, we are playing the Country Grammar video very big. They announced that there would be a show on Labadee Avenue, and they just asked St. Louisans to show up. By the way, one way that we make this accessible is through this vibrating board for people who are deaf. They might not be able to hear Country Grammar, but they can feel it through that accessibility feature. Nelly's studio's microphones were painted in St. Louis Rams gold, which did not age well. Willie Mae Ford Smith was an important gospel singer. Doesn't get recognition until much later in her life, but she trains gospel singers like Mahalia Jackson and Aretha Franklin. One of the last features is Mississippi Nights. This is a club that existed from 1979 to 2007. For us, it's just one of those great moments where visitors get to jump in and share memories. Many people waited in line for shows by that sign that you saw when we first started. And one thing we did is we listed 300 of the biggest shows that were ever at Mississippi Nights to show you the variety of shows that you could see there, but also to spark memories and spark conversations. So we actually have a memory book there where people can leave memories of the favorite concert that they saw at Mississippi Nights. And the very first memory is by a woman who met her husband there. He was the owner of Mississippi Nights, and they got married and then were co-owners. The last feature of the exhibit is this trivia game, and it is another way for us to feature some people who maybe we couldn't feature in before, or who didn't have a huge connection to St. Louis, including Michael Stipe, who lived here a bit during high school, but is much more known for his work with REM in Athens. But this is where we also talk about Sheryl Crow, who we didn't have anything for. So it's a fun way for visitors to end, but also a way for us to get in those extra people and stories. So that's St. Louis Sound. I hope you see that St. Louis should be considered one of the great musical cities, from Scott Joplin to Nelly to places like Mississippi Nights and Club Imperial. It's just an amazing amount of history. And, you know, for all of our exhibits, what we want people to do is leave thinking, I never knew this place was so fascinating. We happen to be telling the St. Louis story through music in this exhibit, but if you walked across the Grand Hall um, you would find the story of how St. Louis women fought for a voice even before they had a vote, and how they were instrumental in the passing of suffrage in the United States. Basically, what we try to do is every year tell you a new chapter of the St. Louis story. Sometimes it's about music, sometimes it's about architecture, sometimes it's about civil rights, sometimes it's about women's history. But as a whole, what we're doing is telling you the St. Louis story. I absolutely love this exhibit. I hope you will come to visit sometime soon. I will stop my share and hope to answer any questions that I can.
Okay, Jody, thank you. That was great. We do have a question from Leslie James, who wants to know if the Tin Music, if there's a digital copy of that available online so you can listen to it.
Absolutely, there is. Sorry I didn't mention it. The Museum of Science and Innovation made a 3D scan, which is the only reason that can still be heard today, because as you saw, it's incredibly fragile. So you can find that on YouTube. And when you go through the exhibit, we're piping that music in above. So it does very much sound like a recording from 1878. But it's fascinating to hear the actual recording itself, and is what makes it so special.
So if there are any questions you have, please put them in the Q&A. Jody, did you want to follow up on a couple of those points that you mentioned in the tour?
Well, yeah, I can mention, I know I mentioned the Chuck Berry family. So in that label, we talk about some of the sexual abuse cases that he faced. We did actually make a mistake in the original label, which opened us up to more discussion. We said that he was found guilty of multiple crimes against women. I can't remember exactly how it was phrased, but we said that he was found guilty of multiple crimes. Turns out he was found guilty of only one. He settled most of the other cases. So we did want to make that change, as it was a factual error, but we also weren't willing to do what the family really would have liked us to have done, which was to not mention any of the sexual abuse cases at all. And we just weren't willing to do that. We can't do that anymore as historians, and especially in St. Louis, where people know the Chuck Berry story. That was important for us to address. So we met with the family and we talked to the lawyer for the estate and just made clear that we were going to talk about these things as well. And the Chuck Berry family actually did a tribute concert here. So it's not like we weren't able to work that out, but they're uncomfortable conversations, but conversations that we have to have.
Jody, you showed the vibration for the music. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the accessibility features?
Sure. So in every exhibit, we do touchables for blind and low vision visitors. We do walking descriptive tours, led now by interpreters in town, but we used to do them ourselves. So we do those walking interpretive tours. We do have Braille labels that people can get. We have large print labels. We're always thinking about how we can serve all of our audiences, including those of different abilities. I will say that those are some of the most meaningful moments to me. I led a walking descriptive tour of one of our exhibits for blind visitors that included the story of the old courthouse, this iconic building in St. Louis history. And I had a model from one of our children's exhibits. And so while I was telling the story of the old courthouse, I gave these visitors the model so that they could feel what it was like. And one of them said, and this is one of my top museum moments of my whole life, one of them said, "Thank you, Jody, because now I can see the old courthouse for the first time. This iconic building that's in postcards and that we see all the time and take for granted, for them to say, and they use that language, I could see the old courthouse for the first time, sent chills up my spine." So.
Yeah, that's amazing. All right. Well, Jody, thank you so much for taking us on the tour today. It was great.
Absolutely.
And again, I hope everyone comes to St. Louis and takes a look at it while it's up. When does it close again?
So it's up all of next year. So it closes in January of 23. So you have plenty of time to see it. And we have a year long programming to help us tell even more stories. So you're going to hear and see some great concerts. So just look at mohistory.org and you can get more information.
Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you, everyone. We have our keynote coming up at 11. So I hope you'll all join us for that as well.
Thank you. Have a great conference.
Thank you.